grateful for you joining us, Professor Bourgeault. Juste pour dire, comme toujours, notre groupe Langue et Santé, qui est mené par Professeur Carolina et moi-même, on fait le tout bilingue. We speak in English and French. We encourage everybody to speak in their comfortable language, and we try to translate. We admit it's a little bit inefficient, mais on le fait fonctionner. Donc, n'hésitez pas à demander qu'on répète dans la langue qui est préférable. And that's how we really learn from each other. Donc, un gros merci, Professeur Bourgault, de vous joindre à nous. Je passe la parole à Satya pour faire les introductions un peu plus spécifiques. Un grand bienvenue. On a beaucoup de personnes qui se joignent à nous pour la première fois, donc aussi un grand bienvenue. Welcome to the people who are joining us for the first time. This is a very informal group of individuals who are interested in language and health, the health of linguistic minorities. We collaborate, we share methodology, we share interesting articles. It's really sort of a coalition of the interested. C'est un vrai plaisir de vous accueillir parmi nous.
OK, excellent. Alors, sans plus tarder, je vais passer à une courte introduction de chacun de nos présentatrices aujourd'hui. Ensuite, je leur laisse la parole. I'm trying to do this bilingually, so je pense que le diapo va être dans une langue et je vais parler dans l'autre langue. So I'll start with Professor Ivy Lynn Bourgeault. She is professor in the School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies at the University of Ottawa and the University Research Chair in Gender Diversity and the Professions. She leads the Canadian Health Workforce Network and has garnered an international reputation for her research on the health workforce, particularly from a gender lens. She was inducted into the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences in September 2016 and received the 2016-17 University of Ottawa Award for Excellence in Research. Next, I will present Nimrit Kenth, who is a research coordinator at Humber Polytechnic and a research assistant with the Canadian Health Workforce Network. She holds an MSc in Global Health from McMaster University and an Honours Bachelor of Health Science from the University of Ottawa. Nimrit's research focuses on health linguistics, equity-oriented policy, systematic data practices, with work that supports initiatives advancing inclusive health workforce policies. And lastly, we have Lise Richard. Alors, Lise Richard est fière acadienne du Nouveau-Brunswick, avec des racines bien ancrées à l'île du Prince-Édouard. Elle est gestionnaire de la programmation à la Société Santé en français. Ses responsabilités incluent la gestion d'une équipe et la planification, la collaboration, la mise en œuvre et le suivi des activités financées par le gouvernement du Canada dans le but d'augmenter l'accès équitable aux services de santé et services sociaux en français pour les communautés francophones et acadiennes en situation minoritaire au Canada. L'équité et les droits de la personne lui tiennent à cœur. À la base, Lise croit aux droits des personnes de s'épanouir, à la richesse de la diversité culturelle et des idées et au fait que le respect mutuel doit guider nos actions et nos décisions. Donc, grand bienvenue to our three presenters. Thank you so much for being here, and I will hand it over to you. And we hope to have some time at the end for questions and discussion.
Right, perfect. I am going to share my screen. All right, are you able to see this?
Yes.
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. So today thank you for that lovely introduction, Satya and Pamela. And today we will be presenting on capturing health professionals' language capacity in Canada, a landscape of registry data collected by provincial, territorial regulatory authorities. To frame today's presentation, I want to begin with the three key domains that shape this work: policy, practice, and research. So these are not just academic categories. They reflect where action is needed to address persistent inequities in access to linguistically appropriate healthcare. From a policy perspective, we look at how legislation and regulation either support or hinder the collection and use of linguistic data. From a practice perspective, we explore what regulatory authorities are actually doing, how data is collected, whether it's shared, and what infrastructure exists to support this. And from a research lens, we consider how these data, or their absence, shape our ability to understand and respond to health inequities. I'll walk you through the background methodology and the findings of our study, and we will return to these three themes again at the end, where we will offer targeted recommendations grounded in each domain. La concordance linguistique est essentielle pour offrir des soins de santé sûrs, efficaces et de haute qualité. Lorsque les patients peuvent communiquer dans la langue de leur choix, on observe moins d'erreurs médicales, une meilleure compréhension et un climat de confiance renforcé. Le Canada est un pays officiellement bilingue où l'accès aux soins devrait être possible en anglais et en français. Cependant, les minorités francophones à l'extérieur du Québec et les minorités anglophones au Québec continuent de rencontrer des obstacles lorsqu'elles cherchent à obtenir des services dans leur langue. Comme l'a reconnu le gouvernement canadien, notamment dans le rapport de Bowen en 2001, les minorités linguistiques sont confrontées à des défis persistants et disproportionnés en matière d'accès équitable aux soins de santé. Pour s'attaquer à ces inégalités, nous avons besoin de données fiables. Les informations sur la langue des patients et les capacités linguistiques des professionnels de la santé sont essentielles pour déterminer si la main-d'œuvre répond véritablement aux besoins de la population. Plusieurs indicateurs peuvent être utilisés. La langue de correspondance préparée, la langue de formation, la capacité déclarée d'offrir des services dans certaines langues, ainsi que la langue dans laquelle les services sont effectivement fournis. Sans données cohérentes et de qualité, il devient très difficile de planifier efficacement et d'assurer une prestation de services équitable. C'est pour cette raison que les autorités de réglementation jouent un rôle clé. Elles constituent l'une des principales sources de ces données. And I will hand it over to Lise.
Merci, Nimrit. Bonjour tout le monde, ça fait plaisir d'être ici parmi vous aujourd'hui. Merci pour cette occasion de vous présenter notre travail. Je voulais surtout vous parler, moi, de mon côté, de notre partenariat avec le Réseau canadien des personnels en santé, qui date quand même de 2015-16. Alors, juste pour vous donner un historique, yeah, thank you. Le comité interne de la SSF sur la donnée a été développé en 2010. Alors, ici, sur cette ligne de temps, je vous présente surtout à propos du partenariat avec l'équipe de Ivy, mais nous, on a aussi une autre stratégie des données qui est liée à la captation des données des besoins de la population, où on privilège l'identification sur la carte santé. Et on a aussi un partenariat avec le réseau de l'Est de l'Ontario, qui est notre partenaire et qui a développé une expertise sur les données. Alors, eux, ils captent des données sur les ressources humaines et appuient aussi le projet de la carte santé. En 2015-2016, c'est à ce moment-là que la Société santé en français initie des rencontres avec le réseau canadien dans le camp des ressources humaines en santé, basé sur leur expertise. Moi et le directeur du temps, on avait connaissance du travail qui se faisait par ce groupe-là et on voulait voir si il y avait un partenariat qui serait possible afin d'avoir des données sur une différente ligne de temps. Alors, ou avec des différents partenaires. C'est à ce moment-là qu'on est arrivé à la conclusion que une étude sur la captation des données de la variable linguistique par les autres professionnels serait très appropriée. Et c'est une étude que nous, on a financée. et à ce moment-là, on est rentré dans un contrat avec l'équipe d'Ivy et sa collègue Chantal Demers dans le temps, qui a fait une étude en 4 phases auprès des autres professionnels. On a choisi 7 professions dans chacune des provinces et territoires. Et ils ont approché ces gens-là de différentes manières sur 4 phases. Et en 2018, dans cette période-là aussi, en 2016-2017, on a commencé des discussions aussi avec Louise Bouchard sur le répertoire des données. Alors, ça parle un peu d'une plus grande stratégie sur laquelle nous, on voulait être impliqués. En phase 2 de l'étude, excusez, j'ai pas bien traduit la première en français. Sur la phase 2 de l'étude, on voulait mettre à jour les données qui avaient été captées en 2017. Et à ce moment-là, on est rentré dans un deuxième contrat. En 22-23, on devient membre du comité aviseur pour la norme sur les données RH. Ivy en parlera plus tard. Puis, en 24-25, on est entré en partenariat à l'invitation de Ivy et de Nimrit pour mettre à jour les données sur la variable linguistique. Alors, c'est un partenariat de longue date qui a beaucoup servi. J'aimerais ajouter aussi qu'en 2019, on a collaboré ensemble sur une rencontre avec des experts à travers le Canada pour commencer à parler de la captation nationale des données sur les ressources humaines en santé. Puis ça a beaucoup mené, en partie mené au projet des données sur les ressources humaines qui est venu plus tard, grâce aux connaissances et aux partenariats qu'avait développé Ivy avec les gens qui étaient autour de la table. You can go to slide 5. Merci. Alors, and you can keep going. Yeah. So, thank you. Alors, ici, au niveau de CHWN, il y avait l'étude, puis il y a un peu de répétition ici, mais il y a l'application en 2020 pour le financement sur les données sur les ressources humaines. Ensuite, la conférence sur les personnels de santé en français. Il y en a eu 3 où est-ce que le projet a été présenté dans ces différentes phases, soit en 2020, 2022 et 2024. Et en 2024, la mise à jour des données. Alors, ça donne un peu le côté de la SSF et le côté du réseau des personnels en santé. Alors ici, je vais passer la parole à Ivy pour continuer. Merci, Ivy.
Excellent. Many thanks. Je suis un peu malade, donc je peux parler anglais peut-être. So thank you for your patience. I wanted to sort of contextualize the partnership that we've had, not only in terms of the work of the Canadian Health Workforce Network and its partnership with Société Santé en Français, but also a lot of this work has been supported through my research chair on gender diversity and the professions. And diversity also includes language diversity. So I think sometimes when people see that title, they don't think language diversity, and that is very important. And in fact, my research chair is what supported Nimrit's work to this work in 2024. One of the other things that we wanted to do is to put this work in a broader context. So we have federal legislation, we have provincial legislation, and we know that we have a complex federated system. The thing that perplexes me a bit is that we have a federal act, the Official Languages Act, which really should apply to provinces and territories because they are members of the Federation. And what is very interesting is that there's a gap between that. And so I think that there is an area here to do some advocacy. And I know that as a professor, sometimes I am told to stick to my lane and do research and teaching and not do advocacy. But I'm too old for that. And so I think that there really does need to be some advocacy. I don't know that I'm the best instrument for that in some cases. So I really want to put that out there. But I wanted to kind of situate this, that the Official Languages Act, as you know, I don't think I need to tell you, is not just about protecting, but promoting in the French language or English language within Quebec, which I know is another different sort of political issue that we're talking about. So right now, the Official Languages Act and also other federal acts like the Employment Equity legislation, which does not include capturing data on language, which it could. It talks about including language on gender, Indigenous identity, racialized identity, and disability. But I think when we talk about equity, diversity, inclusion initiatives, a very invisible diversity initiative is around language. And I think that that's something that needs to be made about that. So we can pass to the next slide.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Ivy. I will take it from here.
Okay.
All right, so this brings us to the regulatory authorities themselves, which these organizations are mandated data collectors. They already gather core registration and renewal information from health professionals as a part of licensing and oversight. And because these data systems are already well established, expanding them to include linguistic capacity is both feasible and low burden. It requires minimal additional infrastructure. It's a simply matter of just adding the appropriate fields. There is a strong dimension of public interest and accountability when it comes to the role of regulatory authorities. So they have a responsibility to serve the public by ensuring that workforce data are accessible, relevant, and useful for planning. So including linguistic capacity in registry data aligns directly with this mandate. It supports transparency, strengthens system planning, and ultimately helps ensure equitable access to care. So together, these layers that Ivy also spoke about, so the federal expectation, provincial legislation, and actual regulatory practice create a fragmented landscape that we see today, but they also can show us where opportunities for improvement lie, as Ivy mentioned, that advocacy piece. In 2017, a foundational environmental scan was conducted with 59 regulatory authorities across 7 professions, so medicine, nursing, occupational therapy, pharmacy, physiotherapy, psychology, and social work. There's a total of 89 possible regulatory authorities at that time, and this work unfolded in 3 main phases. The first phase examined the data collected on the language capacity of health professionals, including whether practitioners reported language of practice, preferred languages of communication, or the ability to provide services in specific languages. The second phase provided an overview of these types of linguistic data being collected across professions and jurisdictions. What emerged was a highly uneven landscape, so where some regulators gathered detailed information and others collected little to none. There is notable variability in the language used to collect, which will be touched upon later. And the third phase assessed the availability of publicly accessible linguistic data. So even when regulators collected valuable linguistic information, it was not always shared either with the public, with researchers, or with the workforce planners. Across all 3 phases, the key findings were clear. Far more linguistic data were being collected than were being made publicly available, and there's remarkable variability across professions and jurisdictions. Some authorities did collect rich linguistic information but didn't publish it, and others had no mechanism for collecting it at all. And these results form the foundation for updated comparative analysis, helping us to understand what progress has been made since 2017 and where barriers still persist. In 2017, the response rate was 59 of 89 authorities, or 65.5%. And when we incorporated the environmental scan, we achieved a 72 of 89 authority completed data points, so 80.9%. We observed strong provincial differences. Regulatory authorities in Ontario and British Columbia were the most likely to both collect linguistic data and make it publicly available. Across professions, psychology had the highest level of both collection and public availability. 8 of 13 authorities collected and disseminated linguistic data, although one of those was difficult to access. Medicine and physiotherapy showed the next highest levels of public availability. 5 of 12 in medicine, and 5 of 13 in physiotherapy, with most regions providing at least some data. In contrast, pharmacy and nursing showed the lowest levels of publicly available linguistic data, pointing to deeper gaps not just in dissemination, but often in the underlying collection of the information. Across all jurisdictions, the message is clear. Even when linguistic data are collected, their impact is limited when they are not publicly shared. Without public access, these data cannot support system planning, equity-focused policy development, or workforce forecasting, and the communities most in need of language concordant care remain underserved. This persistent gap between collection and public availability is one of the central issues our updated analysis set out to examine. Follow-up study. Notre objectif était d'évaluer ce qui a changé depuis 2017 en nous concentrant sur, premièrement, les données linguistiques qui sont recueillies, deuxièmement, les types de données qui sont inclus, par exemple, les langues parlées par opposition aux langues de pratique, et finalement, la question de savoir si ces données sont accessibles au public. Notre étude a utilisé une méthodologie qualitative mixte impliquant les 10 provinces et les 3 territoires pour les 7 professions réglementées. Nous avons mené une enquête de suivi auprès des registraires sur la collecte et la publication des données linguistiques, une analyse actualisée sur les sites web des autorités réglementaires à l'été de 2024. Les données ont été analysées de manière à l'aide d'un système de feu tricolore afin de cartographier la qualité et l'accessibilité des données et de comparer facilement les résultats de 2024 avec ceux de 2017. Il est important de noter que notre outil d'enquête utilisait une langue ouverte afin de refléter les réalités régionales, par exemple en reconnaissant le Nuptut comme langue principale du Haut-Nunavut. Les conclusions principales sont que l'augmentation de la collecte de données, mais certains reculs de leur accessibilité au public et variabilité remarquable selon les professions et juridictions. In 2024, our survey achieved a 55 out of 83 response rate, or 66.3%, almost identical to the response rate in 2017. When we include the environmental scan, we obtained 57 out of 83 complete data points, or 68.7% completeness. When we compare 2024 with 2017, the same overall pattern reappears. The professions of medicine and psychology remained most likely to both collect linguistic data and make it publicly available, although public availability was slightly lower in 2024. These 2 professions have consistently treated linguistic capacity as a meaningful workforce variable, even if the degree of transparency varies. Across both years, regulatory authorities cited 2 major barriers to collecting and releasing linguistic information. So first, many pointed to personal information protection legislation, often interpreting privacy rules as limiting the type of data they could gather or disclose, even when those rules did not explicitly prohibit collection. Second, there's no consistent legislative requirement to collect linguistic data across Canada. In 2017, only 10 authorities were required to collect linguistic data for the registry, so specifically for public dissemination. But in 2024, none of the responding authorities reported a legislative requirement to collect linguistic data for the purposes of public dissemination. This lack of a mandate continues to shape the variability we see across professions and jurisdictions. At the same time, we did identify important facilitators. So the strongest example comes from Ontario, where linguistic data elements were included in the minimum data standard for health workforce data collection. So this was a collected requirement, not public dissemination requirement, but this enabled more systematic collection, improved the data quality, and it did actually result in greater public access to linguistic information compared to most other jurisdictions. We also looked at the role of national bodies. So the Canadian Alliance of Physiotherapy Regulators, for example, has a national service standard that includes the collection of linguistic data. However, this is not consistently reflected in the provincial physiotherapy data, raising broader questions about what linguistic data collection should entail, how standards are operationalized, and whether national guidelines translate into local practice. Taken together, the 2024 findings reinforce what we observed in 2017. Without clear legislative or regulatory requirements, linguistic data collection remains inconsistent and public dissemination remains limited, despite its importance for equity-oriented workforce planning. En 2017, le taux de réponse était 59 sur 89 En combinant les réponses et les données obtenues lors des balayages environnemental, 48 sur 83 autorités recueillant des données linguistiques, alors que seulement 22 sur 89 rendaient ces informations publiques. Deux de ces sources étaient techniquement accessibles, mais difficiles d'accès ou disponibles uniquement sur demande. En 2024-25, le taux de réponse était 55 sur 83. Parmi celles-ci, 43 sur 83 autorités réglementaires recueillant des informations linguistiques, mais seulement 21 sur 83 les rendaient accessibles au public. Bien que ces chiffres semblent relativement stables, ils reflètent les changements structurels importants, notamment des fusions organismes de réglementation et les mises à jour législatives qui ont réduit le nombre total d'autorités, en particulièrement dans les territoires. Cela rend les comparaisons directes plus complexes. Cependant, la conclusion générale demeure claire. La collecte des données s'est légèrement améliorée, mais l'accès public à ces données n'est pas progressé. Now, I'm going to hand it off to Ivy.
Thank you so much. So I think it's really important that we have two gaps. We have the gaps in how many regulatory authority data. So we need to bridge that gap. But if we only bridge that gap and don't address the gap in the publication of that information, further ahead. And this has to be couched in not just that it is an issue of equity, diversity, it's an issue of regulatory authorities of quality and safety. And so it's really important to use the language of regulatory authorities to make the case for the collection and publication of these data. The other is how the data are collected, like what are the questions that are being asked? And it's important to note that there are sort of different pathways of ways these data can be collected. So if we put this in a broader context, right? Regulatory collect the data with their ministry. They may also, and often do, share data with the Canadian Institute of Health Information. So the other pathway is data from state where they locate that directly. So there are three different, oh, I'm sorry if I'm having some difficulty, if people are having difficulty hearing me. It's very odd. We are supposed to have Bell 5 and it's supposed to be great, but it sometimes is not. All right. So my voice cutting in and out. I will try to speak more clearly and slowly. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just turn off so you can hear. Okay, so there are pathways of data from the regulatory authorities to the ministries to CIHI. There are also data that are collected by Statistics Canada. That's great. I'm glad that's better. Now, the way that Statistics Canada collects these data, and this is through the long form census, is they look at your knowledge of the language and your use of the language. So the first and the third. And what we have in the middle is in regards to authorities in Ontario, for example, the Health Professions Database in Ontario, and according to their minimum data standard, and also the Canadian Institute of Health Information minimum data standard. So, and that asks about, are you able to provide services in language? So knowing a language, able to provide services in a language, actually actively using that language, these are three distinctly different aspects. And I think that we would want to be mindful about what is most important to know, what is most important for the public to know, what's most important to know, a planning perspective to make a case for this. Like ultimately, what would be great if there alignment was the most important element or two elements. Because if we go to the next slide, This shows you both in French and in English infographic that was produced by Statistics Canada. And I know these are very small, but you will have the slides subsequently so that you could enlarge them. Generally speaking, what we find is that there's a gap, that there are people with greater knowledge of French outside of Quebec than actually use. Knowledge is in purple and the utilization is in green. So if you look at sort of the graph at the bottom right hand. And so having, being able to kind of juxtapose both of those identifies a gap. So we would want to increase the bilingual nature of different health professionals. But we would also want to ensure that there is active offer and that the different health professionals are utilizing that in their day-to-day work. And so ultimately, we would want to know these data in order to do much better health workforce planning to ensure that bilingual staff are in communities where there are a higher proportion of francophones, to enable francophones outside of Quebec to be able to access services in their language. So those are the main points about it's not just if you collect and make it public, it's about how you collect. And if we could have some alignment, and it would be very helpful, for example, if there was alignment to a minimum data standard across the jurisdictions, and then we would not have the type of variability that we saw in 2017 and continue to see in 2024-25. So there's still a lot of work that can be done. Now, the other issue to highlight is other forms of legislation. So our team from the CIHR-funded Minimum Data Standard Project, of which Société Santé en Français is a partner, we had our legal team look at different legislation to say, is there anything in federal or provincial legislation making it difficult to collect these data and make it available? Long story short, no. Actually, there is legislation that encourages the collection of standardized system-wide health workforce data. This is already in place in Ontario, as Nimrit said, but it is coming into place in British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Do those data standards include language? Well, they do in Ontario, but we're not sure if they do in the other provinces. So there is an advocacy opportunity. Now, health practitioner regulation is one thing. Privacy legislation is another, because this is what we often hear, is that, well, we can collect these data, but we can't share them because of privacy legislation. And I think that that is often an excessively conservative interpretation of privacy legislation. So our team, again, of lawyers, this was a legal team, looked at privacy legislation that governs the collection, the use, and disclosure of identifiable registered data. And in fact, Alberta is a promising practice in that regard. It explicitly permits the collection and disclosure without consent when authorized under a regulator's information code. Now, remember, this is not health data. This is data about practitioners' ability, to provide services in French and other, data elements that are important for health workforce planning. So it's important to note that when we're talking about privacy legislation, we are not talking about any personal health information. This is about professional information about the different practitioners. Also, there are other forms of legislation in terms of anti-racism, which again could be extended to looking at language. This allows public bodies such as regulatory authorities, because again, regulatory authorities are given their power by the provincial government to create a register to regulate the practitioners in the interest of the public. That is the bargain. It is not a professional body in the sense that this is the profession doing it. It is a mandate that they've been given by the ministry, by the public, by all of us. So it allows those public bodies to collect personal information to identify and eliminate systemic inequities, creating a legal basis for the collection of linguistic variables. So again, if you can make a strong case around the systemic inequities, that can be a use of anti-racism or anti-bias legislation. And fourthly, and this is something that was really highlighted by colleagues Arthur Sweetman and Ted McDonald, and Ted McDonald leads Data New Brunswick. And they have been holding data. This is, to our knowledge, the only province that holds data from professional regulatory authorities outside of what is shared with the ministry and shared with CIHI. And so they have a secure data access infrastructure in New Brunswick to enable researchers to work in partnership with regulatory authorities and other organizations, such as those affiliated with Société Santé en Français, to analyze those data. And in fact, in doing some research for this presentation, found that there is an ongoing study in New Brunswick looking at accessibility to different types of health professional services in the province by language. And so that's a really huge opportunity to see that. So these are all ways to permit the sharing of data so that we can have more research, but more knowledge, highlighting the importance of language concordance. I think I pass back to you now, Nimrit.
Great, thank you. Okay, so recherche. Du point de vue de la recherche, l'amélioration de la collecte de données linguistiques est essentielle pour accroître les connaissances du public et de combler des lacunes de longue date. Nous ne disposons toujours pas un portrait complet et cohérent des capacités linguistiques au sein de la main-d'œuvre en santé au Canada, ni des régions où ces capacités sont insuffisantes. Sans cette visibilité, les chercheurs ne peuvent pas analyser correctement les soins en concordance linguistique, ni étudier de manière approfondie les inégalités vécues par les communautés de langue officielle en situation minoritaire, autres langues minoritaires ou par les locuteurs des langues autochtones. Il est également nécessaire d'examiner plus en profondeur les obstacles qui freinent une collecte et une diffusion cohérente des données, notamment l'interprétation de la législation sur la protection de la vie privée, l'absence d'obligations législatives claires et le manque de ressources dont disposent certaines autorités de réglementation. Comme nous l'avons déjà souligné, en fin de compte, l'accès équitable aux soins commence par un accès équitable aux données. Sans connaître les lacunes linguistiques, il est impossible de concevoir des systèmes qui répondent véritablement aux besoins de tous les Canadiens. From a policy perspective, there are several critical steps forward. First, we must focus on asking the right question. A Société Santé en Français recommends asking, do you currently offer services in French yields a far more accurate indicator of real service capacity than asking whether someone can offer services in French. Many regulators assess linguistic capacity internally in multiple ways, yet only release one narrow measure or none at all publicly. The question we ask shapes the data we get and ultimately the policies we design. Secondly, there is an urgent need to standardize linguistic data collection and reporting protocols across Canada. Standardization ensures that key indicators, such as the ability to communicate in particular languages, are collected using shared definitions and methods. This not only improves comparability across jurisdictions, but also strengthens equitable and evidence-informed workplace planning. So national bodies offer a foundation for this. So the Canadian Institute for Health Information, through its minimum data set standards and Pan-Canadian Health Workforce Database, provide the model for harmonized interoperable data collection. So although linguistic capacity is not yet uniformly mandated in CIHI's tools, incorporating language indicators or encouraging regulatory authorities to align with CIHI and Statistic Canada standards would elevate linguistic data to a national priority. So Statistics Canada has now begun work on collecting data on the languages spoken by health professionals, which represents an important step towards establishing a national baseline. However, standardizing these data will require more than simply identifying who can speak a language. It also requires understanding how language is actually used in practice. As several researchers have noted, there can be a significant gap between linguistic capacity and linguistic practice. For example, a provider who indicates that they can speak French does not necessarily offer services in French on a routine basis. Workload pressures, institutional norms, or the surrounding linguistic environment can all limit their ability to practice in that language. In some regions, as per Timoney et al. 2025, who I believe is here today as well, has noted that there is even competition amongst French-speaking providers for French-speaking patients because English-speaking patients may also seek care from bilingual clinicians or other providers, and this reduces the availability of French language care for minority language communities who rely on it most. For these reasons, future policy efforts must ensure that standardized linguistic indicators capture actual service delivery, not just potential or self-reported ability. This nuance is critical if linguistic data are truly going to support equitable workforce planning and service accessibility. And finally, from a practice perspective, we need to strengthen data accessibility. Even in the absence of full harmonization, the data already collected by many provincial and territorial regulators represents a valuable and cost-effective starting point. If these data were enhanced, securely shared, and analyzed by qualified researchers, analysts, and policymakers, they could meaningfully improve system planning. It is equally as important to draw on alternative sources of linguistic data, such as census information, community language profiles, and other population-level data sets, to complement what regulators report. Leveraging these data sources together can support more accurate planning and ensure that both current and future workforce needs are better aligned with the linguistic realities of the community served. Taken together, the research policy and practice recommendations point towards a single overarching objective, ensuring Canada's health system collects, standardizes, and uses linguistic data in ways that genuinely advance equity and improve access to language concordant care. And I'm going to pass it on to Ivy for the final recommendations.
Super. Thank you so much, Nimrit. So I think some key takeaways to keep in mind from this work. First is that we definitely need more research on language concordance, especially with respect to official language in the Canadian context. How are we going to get there is by more accessible and higher quality data. So the data improvements and the accessibility are an end in and of itself. So quality and accessibility of that language data so that we can really identify what are some of the challenges, what are the implications of the current set of circumstances. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, what we want to do is have the right kind of data. And as Nimrit said, we want to align, but even CIHI and StatsCan are not in alignment. So it'd be really great if they could align and that those data standards that they have also are taken into consideration. So we need much more data for health professions in registries and to make that publicly available for the public as well as for researchers. So those are two key takeaways. Other initiatives that we've been working on, and I know Lise mentioned at the outset some work that Louise Bourgeault has done, so a colleague of mine from the School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies. Louise and colleagues were able to design a geoportal, so really to understand geographically where the different francophones were, their needs, and the availability of different professions. So Louise and her team was able to access the health professions database in order to undertake that. And some of the other studies, again, were able to access the health professions database. Now, the health professions database is one of a really particularly challenging database to access. So I think the accessibility of that database, even though there's some really good French language data in it, are becoming less and less available. We are very lucky to be working with our colleague Arthur Sweetman, who does have access to those data. And there is an article that will be coming out shortly, looking at the language of practice among different health practitioners in Ontario, analyzing the 2021 health professions database. So that's going to be coming out in the journal Healthcare Policy. We are also undertaking some work in partnership with Réseau Santé en Français in PEI, to align, because what is really an opportunity in PEI is that you have publicly available data on the language, the preferred language of service for the public. It'd be really great to kind of match that with the ability to provide services in language of the professional, because ultimately when you're doing health workforce planning is you need to match the needs of the profession or the needs of the public with the capacity of the profession. So this is a really great opportunity to look at that in PEI. And I think with that, we are done and looking forward to comments and questions about how to move this forward. So thank you so much for that opportunity.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for a very interesting and engaging talk. I think it aligns with a lot of the work that's done amongst members of the group. So I'm sure there will be lots of questions. So we'll open the floor now. Si vous avez des questions, vous pouvez lever la main ou vous pouvez le mettre dans le chat. Et en attendant, peut-être que je vais commencer avec une question. Again, from someone who has no legal background, trading in law, I guess I was, it was really interesting your analysis on, the legal frameworks across provinces and how you were able to show that in certain provinces there were no barriers. And I wondered whether you anticipated any differences, potential differences across provinces. Do you think that in certain provinces there may be, it may be more difficult?
Yeah, I'm just going to turn off my video so that my voice is quite clear. So first and foremost, I must state that I am not a legal scholar, but I was working with a team of legal scholars, so I'm very confident in their analysis. Having said that, sometimes you can get different opinions from different lawyers about how to interpret certain things. And in fact, I think some legal teams for regulatory authorities lean on a much more conservative interpretation side. So this paper, we are hoping, is going to start a conversation. We are in fact going to be doing a webinar on it next week through the University of Ottawa Center for Health Law and Policy to get this information out. We didn't do all provinces. They did 6. They chose those quite strategically in terms of the variability that they had in health practitioner regulation and privacy legislation. And so the summary is that it is possible. And in fact, if you picked and chose from particular provinces, some things from their health practitioner regulation, some things from their privacy legislation, and put it together, you would have sort of the leading practices. So there isn't one province that has it all, but if you take a little bit from some of the provinces and share, draft legislation, for example, or template legislation. And so that's our hope that the paper will instigate. Thank you.
I think there was a question in the chat that came up right after Ivy, so I think I will answer that first. It is possible to link the language skills of health professionals to the post-secondary institutions where they were trained. So as we mentioned, they already collect this data. It's just not standardized or it's not put into a practical form. So when you apply for to a regulatory authority as a professional, if you are internationally trained, at least they will ask if you to do a test to meet the minimum language in that province. So for example, in Ontario, if you are an internationally trained professional, you need to show that you are able to speak English. And for Quebec, you have to show that you have to speak that in French and vice versa. And then alongside that, they also collect where you did your training. depending on the profession, so this is where the variability comes in. Some of them do require this minimum language standard for nationally trained professionals, but it really is dependent on profession and on authority, which is what we're trying to gather, that there is that lack of standardization. So in theory, yes, you can link those two. It's just a matter of actually taking the data that they have and putting it into practice. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, Lise, on ne vous entend pas.
Okay, got it. Thank you. I wanted to add that this whole thing around legislation and policies becomes really important, because in the first study, we realized that when organizations were saying that they ask if people ask about language, and they said yes, sometimes it was just, do you speak English? So it wasn't necessarily that they were asking the question, what language do you speak? That's a very important distinction in relationship to how the question was interpreted by certain organizations.
Thank you. I think we have Jan next. Oh, I think Jan is frozen. Maybe we'll go on to Patrick and we'll go. Oh no, Jan, you're back. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm back.
Great. Okay.
It's in and out, so I apologize. But I want to thank the presenters very much for the presentation. It succinctly presents an issue that I've been faced with over the last 15 years as I do research on language and access, health access. What really fascinates me is the fact that Quebec, for the 24-25 period, has so much missing information in terms of data. So maybe I'd like to be enlightened about that. Also, I'm very interested in how the concordance has so far been really, from the presentation, has been focusing on the supply side, okay, the health professional side, rather than on the demand side, the health service users, the distribution of them compared to the health professionals. I'm just raising the question. I don't know whether you've given any consideration to this or this is further down the line. Okay, thank you very much.
I can answer that first half about Quebec. So Quebec was added a little bit later. So initially, my work, this was a continuation of my master's work. So in 2024, we focused on French language minorities. So that would be Francophone speakers outside of Quebec. Quebec was added later in that year. In terms of answering, we approached this in terms of the member of a public. So these regulatory bodies are operating for the public, and this information should be made public. So the same way a member of the public would access these authorities, the same way we access them. I go online, I find the contact information, I do several emails, I try to call where there's a number available, and if they do not get back to me, it's the same way as though they would not get back to a member of a public. So really the onus is on the individual regions themselves if the regulatory authorities are not providing an answer or providing this information. And Ivy, I'm not sure if you can talk about the second half of the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think because our work is focusing on trying to enhance the data on the health workforce, because it is significantly in a deficit in comparison to population data. But I think, the work from Patrick and others really highlights that even when we know, as in the case of Ontario, even when we know where health practitioners are and their language capacity, they aren't in the areas where most Francophones live. So because we have the data in Ontario, we are able to highlight that disconnect, and then you are able to advocate. In other places, when you don't have the data, you're not able to advocate for that. So that's a little bit.
I would like to add to that, because there is some parallel work happening in relationship to health data for professions and also for the need. So almost since the same time, even 2014 probably. Société Centre Français has been advocating for capturing data, language data on health cards. So PEI was the first one to do that. They've probably had it. They started the work about 7 years ago now and have full data set on that. In the recent years, then there was a big gap, and suddenly provinces started to be interested in that. So now we have Northwest Territories, Yukon, Nova Scotia, British Columbia that also capture language on their health cards, which is wonderful. And I know at least of 2 others who are considering it. So that data together and Manitoba as well. That data will also be very useful to be able to match. In our collaboration with the Eastern Ottawa French Language Health Network, who have developed a certain expertise in data collection. They are working with each province as well and with the other networks to capture some very interesting data from Stats Canada, so in relationship to health workforce, and also offer support to organizations to be able to capture it within their organization. So I think it's important to talk about that parallel work, and we're hoping, and that's why we went wide at Société Centre Français, because we're hoping that after several years, all of these data will come together and we'll be able to do a better analysis across the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick?
Thank you. So I have a question and a few little comments. First, I think this is excellent work. It's great, and that's sort of where my question is. This is great because I feel like oftentimes when I'm writing introductions and making a case when working with language variables, I'm doing a patchwork of this. So to see this published is excellent. So that was my question. Is it currently published? And if so, can we have a copy of that?
We would be happy to share that with you. It is coming out in a special issue of the journal Health Policy. So not healthcare policy. That's our paper that we published on the Health Professions Database. So this will come out in the journal Health Policy probably sometime in the new year. But we're happy to share that with you in advance because, again, we want people to use this. I think that's really important. And before that would be super. And patchwork is 100% exactly what we see. And it's like the data on French language capacity or provision of services is just a microcosm of the patchwork and variability of all of these other sources of data. And so what we are hoping is that if we could kind of ride the coattails of advocacy initiatives for the French language data, we can get minimum data standards much better integrated more widely. And then we don't just have better data on French language capacity or services, we have just better data on the health workforce in general. So we would feel that would be a win-win.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay, so the comments that I had, one, when looking at some of this provider level ability to speak French, it's often self-reported. So it's providers, for example, the physicians on their annual renewal survey will self-identify the languages in which they're competent enough to practice. And the challenge there is, well, twofold. As you know, not everyone who can does. But we've also done some interviews with physicians, and some of those who barely spoke any French at all said, I always check the French box because in my practice, I'm the only one who can speak any level of French. So I feel almost obligated to do so. And then we've also seen the reverse, where we've done interviews with people that were 100% in French, but they said, I never check the French box because I know that's publicly available and I don't want to be inundated with a bunch of people looking for a French provider. So there is some gamemanship that's happening in that variable as well, which becomes a challenge in our interpretation. So that's sort of one comment.
Absolutely. So how these data are collected, very, very important. And you've highlighted some of those points.
And then the other point that and this is something I've been kind of thinking about, one of the challenges we have when we do language concordant research is we often look at language as being sort of binary. We take a binary approach, English versus French. But communication is in the middle. Like it's not black or white. Communication is gray. Communication is the language that's being used with the patient to sort of maximize the sharing of information. And we keep adding to that gray zone, the more that we encourage and support active offer, because that's what active offer is. It's providing tools for providers to work in the gray, to not go binary French versus English, to be comfortable sharing information in the official language that the patient would sort of prefer. So and I'm having trouble really understanding what to do with that, but it's in the back of my mind always that although we present the data as being black and white, I know that in practice, it's often very gray. And so how do we incorporate that?
Well, and that's why I think we need at least 2 data points, right? If you feel that you have knowledge of and your capacity and service, I like those gradations because it enables you to get that. And then if you have the data on where people were trained, then you have, okay, what was the language of their training? You don't necessarily have to ask that if you knew where they were trained. And that would enable us to have an actual research program on this and not just where we have complete and utter ignorance right now. And it's just unacceptable, So I say it's legally required and it's important for quality and safety. That's a win-win. Why aren't we doing this?
We also agree with Patrick. We agree with Ivy that we need 2 data points, and I also agree with Patrick in relationship to the challenges that it all provides, which is why we also need to work with managers so that they understand they need to organize around health services. It's not enough to just have the data. They need to really see what is needed internally for them to be able to organize those services around by using the data. And we have another project called Equity Link that will help them with that, which is quite extensive in terms of giving direction, etc. The other thing that we realized in working on the project on the health card is that people are capturing the data, but we've come to realize that they're not using it to the extent that they could, including PI, who's been using it for a long time. So there's some advocacy to be done in terms of what that data could provide them, what's in it for them in terms of analyzing it to be able to provide services in a different way to the Francophone population, amongst other things. There's much more information they could get out of that.
Thank you. We're a little bit over time, so unfortunately going to wrap up, but it seems like we'll need a follow-up in the spring, so we're happy to have you back again. I will put in the chat the email for our group. We meet every 2 weeks. It's an open invitation. Anyone who wants to join as well. If you would like, Ivy mentioned they're willing to share the slides. If you would like, contact us and we'll distribute it. Or if you have follow-up questions, unfortunately, we didn't get to all of them in the chat, so I'm happy to pass those on. And so get in touch with us at langue-santé at montfort.on.ca. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Thank you so much to the speakers. Great work and very interesting. Looking forward to more.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, everyone.